This is Gemara Pesachim Daf Samach, the halfway mark of Pesachim, and of course we'll remind yourselves, Tami Nishchat. We're learning all about Karbanos. Let's hope that this year, in a very few short months, we'll be Nageya to bring the Karban Pesach. Today's Daf is sponsored as a special Lezchot Rafua Shlema for a good friend and supporter of the Daf, Chaim Ytzchak Moshe ben Aster Reyzel. He should have a Rafua Shlema B'Karei. We're hoping that he'll be learning together with us very, very soon. Of course, the rest of our Chaim Pichos Ben Malki, the Meir Ben Nikir, Men of Avigos Siparia, Michelis Sipalia Nasei Lehu, Chaim and Sarge Nasurin Reyzel, Sarge Batskananti Basim Tzchai Yisrael B'Mindol. Healthy has everything. Shavalei Shabbos Nami V'Shavik of Yerushalayim for all David Nita Riva Shmuel ben Tehila Daniel ben Chana Reyzel Maglachia Bas Mina Liva Bracha Bas Tovia Musa V'Soy Sha'ar Chayli Yisrael. We pick it up in the bottom of Nun Tes Amid Beis, another Mishnah in Kachim over here, another Mishnah in the parak of Tami Nishchat. Says the Mishnah on the bottom of the Tes Amid Beis Ha Pesach Sheshachtu. The Karban Pesach. Sorry, one more time. Ha Pesach sheshachtu, the Karban Pesach that is shechted shaloi lishmai. V'kibal v'halach v'zarak shaloi lishmai. There's four. Actually, before we even learn the Mishnah, we should actually see the first Rashi. Second Rashi in the Mishnah, Rashi says. There's four critical and crucial ingredients into every karban. There's the shlita, the slaughtering, the kabbalah when you catch the dud, the halacha that you walk with the blood, and the zrika when you sprinkle the blood. These are the four crucial ingredients in every single karban. Din number one we need to know. Din number two that we need to know is as we begin the sugyas of lishma, having the proper intent or having the incorrect intent, that all karbanos, the halacha is, if you have the wrong intent, shaloi lishma does not passel the karban. Aside for two karbanos, the Karban Pesach and the Karban Chatas. So we're discussing Karban Pesach, of course, and if you have a Shaloi Lishma, you have the wrong intent, it could potentially passel up your Karban. So says the Mishnah one more time, Pesach Sheshachtu, you shechted the Pesach Shaloi Lishma for the wrong intention, V'kiva Balach Zarkei Shaloi Lishma, and then you do the Kabbalah, you catch the dough, you walk with the blood, you sprinkle the blood, also Shaloi Lishma, seemingly case number one in the Mishnah. Or case number two, Lishma, V'Shaloi Lishma, you do part for the good reasons, Lishma for the right reason, the part Shaloi Lishma, or you do part for the wrong reason and part for the right reason. Pasal it is pasal. Says the Mishnah, Ketzad l'shmai v'shloi l'shmai. What is a case that you have good intent and not good intent? L'shem Pesach, l'shem shlamim. You first do it for a Pesach and then you have intent for a shlamim. Shloi l'shmai l'shmai. The reverse is what? L'shem shlamim l'shem Pesach. So again, we're seeing the halachas here of l'shma. Says the Mishnah, if you have the wrong intentions of a Pesach, it invalidates the karban. We now know there are four crucial ingredients: the shchita halachas and Kabbalah halacha and zrika, and the Mishnah seemingly discusses a combination when you have partial good intent, partial not good intent, and the Mishnah said it is possible. And that's going to be today's discussion, figuring out what exactly is this case in the Mishnah, and what exactly is the halacha. So let's begin the Gemara. Rav Papa asked a question. This question is going to take us for the entire Amud Aleph onto Amud Beis. What is going on in the Mishnah? When the Mishnah said you have partial good, partial not good kavanah, is that all within one avodah? While you're doing the shechita, you begin thinking, I want this to be for a Pesach, and then you continue thinking you want it for a shlamim? Or does it mean during the shechita you think one thing, and then during the Kabbalah, as you're catching the blood, you see something else in two different avodas? What's the question? The Gemara elaborates. Is it all within one avodah of Rav Yosi? And we're going with the opinion of Rav Yosi, which we had a little bit of an introduction to this a few days ago. The Amar, what does Rav Yosi hold? Af b'Gemara dvar of Adam nitzvas. Rav Yosi holds that when you make one statement, when you say I want this to be a karban shlamim and a karban ayla, says Rav Yosi, we look at your whole words. We don't just say the first word. Says Rav Yosi, and therefore in such a case, if someone were to say I want to be a shlamim and a ayla, that's obviously impossible. It has a messed up gender. So what do we do with this animal? We just have to let it graze until it gets a mum, and then we're going to be done with the animal because you can't bring it as a carbon. But the crucial ingredient there, Rav Yosi says, we look at all your words. So similarly, says the Gemara, Rav Yosi will look at your entire machshava. Then let's say you're doing the shechita. At the beginning of the shechita, you think l'shem karban Pesach, and then as you're continuing the shechita, what do you think? L'shem different carbon. In that case, what would Rav Yosi be teaching us? Rav Yosi would say it's not a good carbon. That would be if it's in one avodah. Di Rameir, because if it's Rameir, Amar Tavas L'shem Rishon. Rameir would always say we go with the first thing you think, and similarly, if you're in one avodah, you have two different kavanas, we don't care, we'd go with the one avodah, just like if someone says I want to be a shlamim and I want it to be an ayla. Rameir holds it's a shlamim, so do over here, if you had intent for it to be a Pesach and then you had intent for it to be something else, it would not bother us. So says the Gemara, is the Mishnah talking about one more time one avodah and we're within the sheet of Rav Yosi, or as we turn along to Amud Aleph Daf Samach Oidilma, or perhaps the Mishnah is talking about you have this intent in two different avodas, and even according to Rameir, Damar Tveis translation Rishon. The Rameir says we generally go with the first thing that you think. Honey, Mili, when does Rameir say we go with the first thing that you think? When does Rameir say that we could stop it in the middle? That's That's again, if you're doing the shechita and you think two different things, we'll say whatever your first kavanah was, that's what it will be. Aval b'shtei avodos. If it's two different avodos, if by the shechita you're thinking one thing, but by the Kabbalah you're catching the blood, you think something else, that it would be possible. So again, asks Rav Papa, what is the case in the Mishnah? The Mishnah said, partial lishma, partial lo lishma is no good. Partial for good intent, partial for Pesach, partial for not good intent, partial for shlamim, no good, said the Mishnah. What is that case in the Mishnah? Asks Rav Papa. Is it going all in one avodah and we're going with Rav Yasi, or is it going in two avodas and we're going even in Ram Meir? Before we go to try to prove the answer to the question, the Gemara says, Amri Ahai. Which case in the Mishnah are we going on? If you're going in the case of the Mishnah, that you first think the wrong intention and then you think the right intention. Who cares, says the Gemara. Doesn't make a difference, because once you have that bad intention, once you think, okay, I want this to be a shlamim, it's game over. This carbon is puzzle, according to every sheet in the world. So what would be the question? Because Rav Yasi agrees. He agrees that you also go by the latter words. You also go by the latter words. Says the Gemara, Ella, so what's the case in that Rav Papa is asking his question on? Ella lishmai v'shalei lishmai mai. Again, so when he does the shechita, while he's doing the shechita, he thinks, I'm doing this for the carbon Pesach. And then he continues and he thinks carbon shlamim. Or then he does the Kabbalah, halacha, or zrika, and thinks for the wrong carbon. What is halacha in that case? That is the question of Rav Papa. We're now going to go and have 4 different attempts at answering this question of Rav Papa. Again, trying to figure out the din in our Mishnah. The din in the Mishnah that said that when you have these two intents, you have intent lishma and shalei lishma, said the Mishnah, it is possible. What was that talking about? Again, we're going in the case of lishma v'shalei lishma. You originally had a good intent, then you have a not good intent. What is the halacha in that case? Is that talking about specifically one avodah within the shita of Rav Yasi, or is that even talking about in 2 avodas within the shita of Rav Meir? Says the Gemara, let's try to prove it. Before we begin, let's just point out 2 very important things. Number 1 is that when we keep on saying that you have kavana, what does kavana mean? So kavana means intent. Do you have to say it? Do you have to say l'shem Pesach, l'shem shlamim? Is the case of the Mishnah that you say the wrong thing? So again, a lot of these things are very big sugyas. We'll try to point out the ikar machlekes. Over here, this is a machlekes that Rashi says you have to actually say it out. If you just think the wrong thing, that will not be enough. Rashi says you have to say that I want it to be for the wrong carbon. However, the Rambam, many learn, the Mishnah Melech, for example, learns that no, it's even going to be a psul if you just think for the wrong carbon. Tashema, let's begin the rayas, and the last point to point out is we're going to have 4 potential rayas, and then at the end of the day, we're not going to have an answer to this question, and we're going to leave it as an unanswered question. But let's see the 4 potential attempts at answering this question. Tashema, about 8 lines on the top. First one line is Ha Pesach. Tashema, Ha Pesach sheshachtu shalei lishmai. The Pesach that you shechted for the wrong reasons. V'kibo v'alach v'zarek shalei lishmai. And then you did the other avodas. You catch the blood, you walk with the blood, you sprinkle the blood for the wrong reasons. Says the Gemara, Hey Chidami, what's this brisa talking about? Inema. What's the Inema? If you're going to tell me Kidiktani, like the word said, which said that what? You did the shechita shalei lishma, you did the Kabbalah, the halach, this week you did everything shalei lishma. Lama li adam echashav lekulu. Why do you have to tell me the fact that you made them all for the wrong intent? Mika ma'isa if saleh. Once you had the first thing, once you did the wrong intent, once it's shalei lishma by the shechita, by the slaughtering, it's over, it's puzzle. So why do you have to tell me that the rest of them you also had the wrong intent? What's the point of that? Says the Gemara, Elalav, what must the case be talking about? This is what I meant to say. Inami. Again, the wording was, and the brisa, which is the same wording in our Mishnah, was the vav, which a vav very often means and. Sometimes it means or. So originally we thought it meant and we said you had bad intention by the shechita, you had bad intention by the Kabbalah, bad intent each one. Now the Gemara is saying no. You know what it really means? It means inami. It means or. So now let's explain. Inami or shachtu lishmai v'kiba v'alach v'zarka shalai lishmai. Or you did the shechita for the good reasons, and then you did the other avodas for the bad reasons. Inami shachtu v'kiba v'alach lishmai. Or you did all the first 3 for good reasons, zarka shalai lishmai, and you did the final one for Lishma. In all these cases, the have your law shtei avodas. Over here we see it's clearly two different avodas that we're honing in on. Partial good intent, partial not good intent. And what did it say? It said it invalidates the carbon. So seemingly we're bringing a raya that in the case of our Mishnah, as the Gemara is going to elaborate right now, will be the same thing. Says the Gemara, Ema Seifa. But then let's continue. That was the first part of the Mishnah. Ema Seifa. What did the Seifa of the Mishnah say? Lishmai v'shalai lishmai. So Echidami. What was that case? We just explained that the first line of the Mishnah is referring to what? Partial good, partial not good. Then the Seifa of the Mishnah said the opposite. Lishmai v'shalai lishmai. What's that case? If you're going to tell me that what? It also means two different avodas. Hainu reisha. It's the exact same thing as the reisha. Elalav. So what must you mean? It must mean it's all in one avodah. And yet we're saying it's possible. And therefore what? For Rav Yosi Damar Abigmar Devarav. Adam Nitvas. The Gemara wants to prove that since from the first part of the Mishnah is talking about two avodas, the inami that we have to learn in the Mishnah, the Chiddush is that you partial good, partial not good, two different avodas. The Seifa must be talking about one avodah, and yet it says it's no good. It must be we're going within the Shita of Rav Yosi, that even within one avodah, the Afikmar Dvar of Adam Nitzvah, we go through your whole intent, your whole wording, and therefore when you did part of it Lishma, part of it Shno Lishma, within one avodah, within the Shechita, within the slaughtering, that also will invalidate the carbon. Says the Gemara, nothing doing. Really, I'll tell you some two different avodas. The Reisha is talking about as you're doing the slaughtering, you have intent about the slaughtering Shalai Lishma for the wrong carbon. Or you have doing the zrika, the sprinkling, and each carbon, each part of the carbon, you have intent about that part. Seifa, the end of the Mishnah is the kai b'shchita. You have intent about a different part of the carbon, different part of the avodah. The Amar, what's the case? When he does the Pesach, he's shechting and he says, I'm doing the lishma, the shame carbon Pesach. Lizroi damai shalai lishmai. But he's doing the shchita, and at the time of the slaughtering, his intent or his words, he's saying, I'm going to do this zrika, I'm going to do this sprinkling for what? For the wrong person, for the wrong purpose of the carbon shlamim. The kamash malan in the chiddush of the Mishnah is the mechashlim me'avoida levoida v'anebait derapapa, that this is a shayla that Rapapa discusses in Shchitas Kachim Daf Yomi. Rashi says, and the Mishnah is teaching us a chiddush that you could even invalidate a carbon if at one avodah you have intent for a different avodah shlei lishma, even that will passel up the carbon. But we do not necessarily have a raya whether the Mishnah is talking about one avodah or two avodas, because that is going to be the chiddush of the Mishnah. Potential raya number one, deflection number one. Tashema, potential raya number two. The Mishnah said if you have the wrong intent and a good intent possible. Hey Chidami, what's the case? If you can tell me if you're going to tell me that, what's the case? Shalai lishma, bad intent and then good intent. If you're going to tell me it's referring to two different avodas, hashta. Now let's think about this. Lishma, when you first have good intent and then you have bad intent, Amre Pasal, the Mishnah says that is puzzle. You started off good and you ended bad. That's no good. So certainly if you started off bad and you ended off good, it's going to mess you up. So what's the chiddush? What must the chiddush be? So about one avodah meseva b'avodah achas. Reisha nabi avodah achas. The Reisha is also going by avodah achas, and therefore we have a raya again that we're going within the shita of Rav Yosi. Answers the Gemara loy. Nothing doing loylam mishtei avodas. Ubedinu d'lo yitzrich lei. And really, you're right. The Mishnah is extraneous mixtures. Actually, we do not need to write both cases. Very often we have parallelism in the Mishnah, so of course we said it one way, we said it the other way, even though it is true once we knew that if you start off good and you start off bad. So, one more time. Once we know that when you start off good and you ended bad is no good, Kol Shekain, certainly if you start off good and it start off bad and ended good, but just said it to be parallel in the Mishnah. Therefore, says the Gemara, potential raya number two. Deflection number two. Tashemai, potential raya number three, about 12 lines on the bottom. Shachatu shalei la'ichlav v'shalei l'mnuyaf. You shachted the carbon, and you did it shalei la'ichlav. Either people that are not potential, people that are sick, people that cannot eat the carbon. Or shalei l'mnuyaf. We all know that didn't carbon Pesach is you have to be registered on your carbon. So you shachted it with intent for someone not registered on it. La'arelim, someone who did not have a bris milah. Ulitmeim, someone who is tamei. Puzzle, that carbon is puzzle. Hacha, over here, pshita b'avodah achas. Of course, it's talking about one avodah, just talking about the shchita. That's all it's talking about. Umedeseva b'avodah achas, rishna b'avodah achas. This sefer, what do you mean sefer? We didn't see these words. This is the next Mishnah. So we see that the next Mishnah is talking about one avodah. Certainly, the Reisha, again, we always find two Mishnahs back to back. The Reisha Arab Mishnah is also avodah achas. So it's Rav Yasi says Gemara nothing doing. Midi Ayriya Kedisa Vakadisa no Raya. Save avodah achas Reisha. Seems about one avodah. Reisha our Mishnah avodah achas ibshtei avodas. It's not muchach. It's not conclusive. Our Mishnah could be either one. Tashema, the fourth and final Raya lo'eichlav shlei lo'eichlav. Very similarly, now you shechted it for a dual intent. You shechted it for some people could eat and some people can't eat. A regular healthy person and a chayla zakin someone who's old and cannot eat. Kasher, that shechita is kasher. Hey chidami, what's the case? If you can tell me it's two different avodas, and the reason is because you thought about the zrika, the ein machshavas oichlan bizrika. The when did you think that you're doing it for a person that partially could eat and partially cannot eat? You thought that at the time of the zrika, and the halacha is ein machshavas oichlan bizrika. You cannot mess up the carbon by the zrika if you're having intent about the eating. But it would teach us that would be if it's two different avodas, the shchita and the zrika. But if it's during one avodah, can go in bishchita during the shchita the mahan yibei machshavas oichlin while you're doing the shchita, it could mess it up if you have intent for the wrong person to eat it. Pasal, it would pasal. What would the chadish be? Mixas oichlin loy pasal. The partial people who cannot eat it does not pasal. Again, what was the case? Lo oichlav vishaloi lo oichlav. And yet we see that what's halacha? It's going to be kosher. What's the reason it's going to be kosher? Must be the reason is because since you didn't mixas partial for people who could eat, partial people who cannot eat, that's going to be kosher. As we flip along to Samacham and Beis, says the Gemara, Elalav. Rather, what must you tell me? You must tell me that's about one avodah. Therefore, again, if the next Mishnah is one avodah, our Mishnah must be one avodah. And therefore, again, we're going to have a raya. They're going to sheet the Rav Yasi. When avodah says the Gemara, the same answer. No raya, mida, ayriya, hakdisa, vakdisa, save avodah achas, reishi ba avodah achas, like b'shtei avodas. Says the Gemara, 4 potential rayas, 4 potential deflections. We are left with a shayla. We began after the Mishnah, the shayla of Rapapa, by Rapapa. At the beginning of today's daf, Rapapa asked, what is the case in the Mishnah? When the Mishnah said lishma v'shlei lishma, lishmai v'shlei lishmai, partial good, partial not good, partial pesach, partial shlamim. Said the Mishnah, it's no good. What was the case? Which says Rababa, was it one avodah like Rav Yasi that we even go with the full words that you said, or was it Rameir we only go with the original words? But it's talking about two different avodas, and by two different avodas, Rameir agrees. 4 potential rayas seemingly trying to prove that it's going within one avodah like Rav Yasi. Each one deflected, and the Gemara leaves it at that. Ibayilahu, says the Gemara. New Shaila. 5 lines down, Samacham and Beis. Pesach sheshachtu b'shar yimois hashana. You shechted the carbon Pesach throughout the rest of the year. Lishmai v'shaloi lishmai mahu. Now, we have to know a very interesting din that happens with the carbon Pesach. Carbon Pesach, if you take a carbon Pesach and you shecht it throughout the year, and you shecht it for a shlamim, then it is kosher. If you shecht again the carbon Pesach throughout the rest of the year, not a Pesach, the rest of the year you shecht for a shlamim, then it's going to be a kosher carbon. But on Erev Pesach, it cannot be a shlamim. Obviously, it has to be a carbon Pesach. However, before Pesach, what happens? Let's say you shechted for a Pesach, then it's not kosher. So we have an irony going on over here. If you do something lishma for the right reason, meaning for a Pesach, but it's at the wrong time, you're middle of January, and you're today, and you shech the carbon Pesach for l'shem Pesach, possible. If today you were to shech, today you can't shech anyway, no karbanis, but it's not a mikdash mikdash. If you were to shech the carbon Pesach l'shem shlamim today, then it would be kosher. So again, lishma, let's not get confused. Here, lishma is going to mess you up because it's at the wrong time. Shaloi lishma is going to help you because you're at the wrong time. But now, what's the question? What if you have a dual kavana? During the year, so if you did a lishma, it's no good. You did a shaloi lishma, it's yes good. What if you did both of them? You did it for a Pesach and a shlamim. Says the Gemara, Mi asi shaloi lishma. Does the shaloi lishma, the fact that you want it to be a carbon shlamim, come, umabik le midi lishma, and it uproots and destroys the lishma, destroys the shlamim, umachshir le, and therefore it's going to be kosher, or no? Again, let's just say this over one more time to make sure it's very clear. Throughout the whole year, if you shech the Pesach as a shlamim, it is kosher. So if you shech the Pesach shaloi lishma, not for the right intent throughout the whole year, that is good. If you did a lishma as a Pesach, that is no good. So we want to know if you did a dual purposes, what is halacha? Says the Gemara, do we say that my kavanah shaloi lishma, my intent for the wrong reason, my intent for a shlamim, which is good throughout the whole year, does that come and uproot my intent for the Pesach, and therefore it's going to be kosher, or not? Says the Gemara, Ki Asur Avdimi Amar Amrita L'Shmaita Rav Yirmiyah, they said in front of Rav Yirmiyah, Hayelu lishmai machshiri. Now we're going to try to bring a raya, a bit of a lengthy and wordy raya. Do we say, Hayel lishmai machshiri? Normally the right intent makes it kosher, bismani on Pesach. Vishalai lishmai machshiri shalai bismani. And we have intent not for the right purpose for a shlamim throughout the whole year, that also makes it kosher. So now let's equate the two. Ma lishmai hamachshiri bismani. Just like intent for a Pesach, which makes it kosher on Pesach. Ein moitzia midei shalai lishmai does not uproot it from a shalai lishmai, meaning if on Pesach you would have intent for dual purposes like our Mishnah, you would have intent for Pesach and shlamim, it would not be good on Yom Tiv. It would not allow the carbon Pesach kavanah to kill out and knock over the shalai lishmai. So have shalai lishmai machshir shalai bizmana in maitzia midei lishmai upasul. So too throughout the whole year, the kavanah, the intent for the shlamim, cannot come and knock over the intent for the Pesach and make it kosher. So says the Gemara, seemingly it should be pasul. That was the raya they tried to bring. V'amar li, and he said to me, lie, nothing doing, not a good comparison. Im amri b'shalai lishmai. If you're going to tell me shalai lishmai, would you have intent for shlamim? Shekei noyig b'chol azvachim. That is relevant by all karbanos. Timer b'lishmai shkein einoy noyig b'chol azvachim. What's the comparison? When it comes to a Pesach, the Pesach is a special din of lishma. That din of lishma is nothing to do with all other din by all other karbanos. So therefore, you can't bring me a raya from the Pesach's din of shalishma to the din of shalai lishma. Meaning, we wanted to bring a raya for the fact that on Yom Tiv, if you have intent for a Pesach and a shlamim, it's no good. So also to not on Yom Tiv, if you have a Pesach for a shlamim and a not shlamim, it should also be no good. Says Gemara, what's the raya? The din of lishma by Pesach is a special din by Pesach. So maybe over there it's more chomer for that reason, but you can't bring me a raya. It's the rest of the year. Again, says the Gemara, okay, so my Havela, what's the maskana? Amar Rava. Rava says, Pesach shechtu b'shayim esashana l'shmai, v'shalai l'shmai, kosher. A carbon Pesach you shechted throughout the whole year for the right reason and not the right reason, it's kosher. Meaning the shlamim does knock over the other one. Why? The stama l'shmai kai, because the stama is l'shma, and yet avilochi kishachalei shalai l'shmai kosher, and yet when you shech the shalai l'shma, you shech for a shlamim, that's kosher. Almost, what do we see? Yasi shalai l'shmai, mabilei midi l'shmai, and therefore it knocks it over. So too, if you shech for l'shmai, v'shalai l'shmai, l'shmai, mabilei midi l'shmai. A very gishmaka raya. Says the Gemara, what's the stam? When you do something with no intent, what do we assume? You did it for the right reasons. Says the Gemara. So throughout the whole year, when you did it stam, that's called l'shma. That's as if you did it for what? The carbon Pesach. And yet, if you have intent for what? The shlamim, shaloi l'shma, that shlamim intent cancels out and destroys the l'shma intent. So too, says the Gemara, so too, just like implied intent, a stam l'shma will get knocked over by a what? By a shaloi l'shma, by a shlamim. So too, if I have a real intent for a shlamim and a real intent for a Pesach, the shlamim will be able to knock it over. Now, obviously, everyone now knows what the Gemara is about to counter Taina. Says the Gemara, Amar le Rav Ada bar Hava le Rava, Dilma, what's the raya? Shiny echad the Amar meechad the loy Amar. Maybe implied and real intent is not the same thing. Meaning, the fact that you, by stam, without any intent, we say it's l'shma, and then we know that when you have it for the shlamim, shlamim can knock it out. But that's not a raya to case you actually had intent for both. Why? Because we find the eichlav shlei eichlav kasher. If you did it for both, people who can eat and people who cannot eat, that is kosher. And yet if you did it just for one who cannot eat, it's going to be basel. It's going to be basel. So why is it going to be basel? We know that the stam is for people who are going to eat. So why don't we say, very good, you had intent for people who can't eat, but there's this stam, there's this implied intent for people who could eat. So maybe the implied intent should come along and be strong enough to make the carbon kosher. Ella, what's obviously do we see? And therefore, says the Gemara, we have no raya. Amar Lei responds, Midi Iria, what's the Shlama Hasam, Kamadloi Akar Le B'Shchita, Stame, Vadilishma. Very good over there, as long as you didn't uproot it with the Shchita, the stam of every carbon is the Shmakai. Elahecha, Elahacha, but in this case, you're bringing me a raya from a case where you shechted for someone who cannot eat. Stame La'eichlav Kai, Dilma Mamshachei Hani, Vasi Achrina Memnele. maybe these will begin and other people will come and take their place. The Tanan, like we learned in the Mishnah, with this we're going to conclude. The Tanan, like we learned in the Mishnah, Nimnin, you appointed someone on the carbon who they pulled away their hands, meaning, and therefore you could change it. So therefore says the Gemara, it's not necessarily a raya from the fact that we find that if you shechta for someone who cannot eat, though we don't say that the stomach, the imply that you always do for someone who could eat, should uproot it. You know why? Because you could change. When it comes to appointing someone on the carbon, you could always change. Therefore that is not a raya. And again, the Gemara concludes in this question as well that we do not have an answer. We did have Rava. The Rava wanted to say that it's going to be kosher, and then Rava tried to prove it, but the proof was deflected, but seemingly the din of Rava does stand. We'll pick it up from here tomorrow.